The autumn sun hung low over Deadwood Gulch like a bloodshot eye, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street, where a crowd had gathered for what passed as entertainment in the Montana Territory of 1876. Jake Mackenzie sat his horse at the edge of the mob, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his cavalry hat, a remnant from his days fighting for the Union in a war that had ended 11 years ago, but still lived in his bones. At 38 years old, Jake had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh battles, where good men died for causes that seemed clearer then than they did now, out here in the vast emptiness of the frontier. These days, he ran cattle on a small spread 15 miles north of town, kept to himself, and tried to forget the sound of artillery and dying men. But today, the crowd's bloodthirsty chatter brought it all rushing back. String him up, shouted Walt Garrison, the town's blacksmith, his meaty fists raised above his head. Teach these savages what happens when they steal from white folk. The object of the crowd's fury stood on the back of a wagon beneath the town's hanging tree, a gnarled oak that had witnessed more than its share of frontier justice. The condemned man was young, maybe 20 years old, with the lean build and proud bearing of the Lakota people. His hands were bound behind his back, and despite the rope around his neck, he held his head high, looking out over the jeering crowd with dark eyes that showed no fear, only a kind of weary acceptance that made Jake's stomach turn. "What's the boy accused of?" Jake called out to Marshal Pete Hawkins, who stood near the wagon with the hangman's noose in his hands. Hawkins, a small man who wore his badge like armor against his own cowardice, glanced up nervously. "Caught him red-handed stealing supplies from Morrison's store, Jake. 3 witnesses saw him do it. That right?" Jake guided his horse closer, studying the young man's face. There was something about him, a dignity that seemed out of place for a common thief. "Boy, you got anything to say for yourself?" The crowd quieted slightly, curious to hear what the condemned man might offer in his defense. The young Lakota met Jake's eyes directly, and when he spoke, his English was clear and precise. "I took nothing that was not already mine by right," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "The supplies were promised to my people in the treaty your government signed 2 winters ago. When we came to collect what was owed, we were turned away with guns and curses." "He's lying." Morrison, the store owner, pushed through the crowd, his face red with indignation. "Indians don't have no treaty rights to my goods. This savage broke into my store and was filling a sack with flour and beans when we caught him." "Because my people are starving," the young man replied calmly. "Because the government agents take the supplies meant for our children and sell them to line their own pockets. I am White Hawk, son of Chief Standing Bear. I took only what was promised to feed my village's children." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard the rumors about Agent Crawford and his creative bookkeeping, about supplies mysteriously disappearing between the government warehouses and the reservation. But rumors and proof were different things, and this boy was about to hang for what might have been a desperate attempt to honor his father's responsibility to his people. "Marshal," Jake said slowly, "you got proof this boy actually stole anything? Or just Morrison's word against his?" Hawkins bristled. "We got 3 witnesses, Mackenzie. What more proof you need? Let me talk to them." The 3 witnesses stepped forward. Morrison himself, his assistant Danny Crawford, the Indian agent's nephew, Jake noted, and a drifter named Kellerman who'd been drinking in the saloon when the alleged theft occurred. As Jake questioned each man, a picture began to emerge that didn't sit right with his sense of justice. Morrison claimed he'd seen White Hawk breaking into his store through the back window. But when Jake asked him to describe what the boy was wearing, Morrison's description didn't match the clothes White Hawk wore now. Danny Crawford claimed to have seen the theft from across the street, but when pressed for details, his story kept changing. And Kellerman reeked of whiskey and could barely stand upright, let alone serve as a reliable witness. "This is taking too long," shouted someone from the crowd. "We got work to do." "Yeah," called another voice. "Hang the redskin and be done with it." Marshal Hawkins, clearly eager to please the mob, stepped toward the wagon. "All right, that's enough questions. Boy's guilty as sin, and we got a hanging to finish." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had always preceded battle. Moment when talking stopped and choices had to be made. He'd spent 11 years trying to avoid such moments. But here it was again, a young man's life hanging in the balance, and a crowd of people willing to let injustice happen because it was easier than seeking the truth. "Marshal," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops in battle, "I'm calling for a delay. This boy deserves a proper trial with a circuit judge, not a lynch mob." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but Jake ignored them. His attention focused on Hawkins. The marshal's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped when he saw the cold steadiness in Jake's eyes, the look of a man who'd faced down Confederate cavalry charges and lived to tell about it. "You got no authority here, Mackenzie," Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I got the authority of a citizen demanding justice," Jake replied, "and the backing of any man here who still believes in a rule of law over mob rule." He looked out over the crowd, searching for allies and finding few. These were mostly good people, he knew, but fear and prejudice had turned them into something ugly. Still, he had to try. "Folks, I fought for this country because I believed it. Stood for something better than this. You want to hang a man, at least make sure he's guilty of more than being born with the wrong color skin." "He's a damn Indian, Mackenzie," Walt Garrison roared. "That's crime enough, is it?" Jake's voice cut through the noise like a saber. "Because if that's true, then everything I fought for in the war was a lie. Every man who died at Gettysburg died for nothing." The crowd grew restless, sensing the confrontation building between Jake and the marshal. Some began to drift away, uncomfortable with the turn the day had taken. But others pressed closer, their mood turning uglier by the moment. Marshal Hawkins made his decision. "I ain't waiting for no circuit judge, Mackenzie. This boy hangs today, and if you don't like it, you can take it up with the territorial governor." He raised his hand to signal the wagon driver, and Jake knew he was out of time. The moment had come, just as it had at Bull Run and Chancellorsville, the instant when a man either acted according to his principles or lived forever with the knowledge that he'd let evil triumph through his inaction. Jake spurred his horse forward, drawing his Colt .45 in one smooth motion. The crowd scattered as he rode directly toward the wagon, his pistol aimed not at any person, but at the rope above White Hawk's head. "Last warning, Marshal," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Let the boy down, or I'll cut that rope myself." What happened next would echo through the territory for years to come, and set in motion events that would test Jake Mackenzie's courage in ways that even the Civil War had never demanded. The crack of Jake's Colt .45 split the afternoon air like thunder, and the rope above White Hawk's head parted in a shower of hemp fibers. The young Lakota warrior dropped hard onto the wagon bed, gasping and clutching at his throat, where the noose had left an angry red mark. The crowd erupted in shouts of outrage and confusion, some people diving for cover while others reached for their own weapons. "Nobody move," Jake commanded, his voice carrying the authority earned in a dozen cavalry charges. His horse pranced nervously beneath him, but he kept the animal steady while sweeping his pistol across the crowd. First man who draws iron gets to meet his maker. Marshal Hawkins stood frozen, his hand halfway to his gun, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "Mackenzie, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Maybe so," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the crowd. "But I can live with making mistakes. I can't live with letting an innocent man hang." He guided his horse closer to the wagon, addressing White Hawk without looking away from the potential threats around them. "Boy, can you ride?" White Hawk nodded, still working his throat where the rope had bitten. "Yes." "Then get on my horse behind me. Slow and careful. These folks are spoiling for blood, and I'd rather not give them an excuse." The young warrior moved with fluid grace, despite his bound hands, swinging up onto Jake's horse with practiced ease. Jake could feel the tension in the crowd building like pressure in a boiler, ready to explode into violence at any moment. "This ain't over, Mackenzie," Walt Garrison shouted from the safety of the general store's porch. "You just signed your own death warrant." "That's as may be," Jake said, backing his horse away from the crowd. "But at least I'll die knowing I stood for something." As they rode out of Deadwood Gulch, Jake could hear the angry voices behind them growing louder. He knew word would spread quickly about the rancher who defied a lawful hanging, about the Indian he'd saved, about the trouble that was sure to follow. By nightfall, every ranch and settlement within 50 miles would know what Jake Mackenzie had done. They rode in silence for the first few miles, following a deer trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen, showing their autumn colors. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and copper. It was beautiful country, Jake reflected, the kind of land a man could love enough to die for, which might be exactly what he'd just done. "Why?" White Hawk finally asked, his voice still rough from the rope. "Why did you save me?" Jake considered the question as they climbed higher into the foothills, the town falling away behind them like a bad dream. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I've seen too many good men die for bad reasons." "You fought in the white man's war. It wasn't a question." Jake nodded. 4 years. "Captain, 1st Montana Volunteer Cavalry. Learn to kill. Learn to die. Learn to live with both. And now?" "Now, I raise cattle and try to forget." Jake glanced back at his passenger. "What about you? You really steal from Morrison's store?" White Hawk was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of profound sadness. "My people were promised food and supplies in the treaty made at Fort Laramie. Every month, the agent is supposed to distribute what the government sends. But Agent Crawford sells half of it to the mining camps and keeps the money. My father's people grow hungry while Crawford grows rich." "So you took what was owed?" "I took enough flour and beans to feed the children for 1 week. Nothing more." White Hawk's voice hardened. "But in Morrison's eyes, and in the eyes of your law, I am nothing but a thief." Jake pulled up his horse at a stream crossing, letting the animal drink while he studied the young man's face. There was intelligence there, and strength, and a deep well of pain that Jake recognized from his own mirror. "Your father is Chief Standing Bear?" "He is. A great leader who has tried to keep peace between our peoples. But peace is hard to maintain when children cry from hunger and promises are broken like twigs underfoot." Jake had heard of Standing, Bear, a chief known for his wisdom and his attempts to find common ground between the Lakota and the white settlers. If this boy was telling the truth, then Jake had just saved the son of one of the few Indian leaders trying to prevent all out war. "I'm taking you to my ranch," Jake said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "We'll get those ropes off your hands, get you fed and rested. Then you can decide what you want to do. And what will you do when they come for you? Because they will come, Jake Mackenzie. The marshal will not let this insult pass." Jake had been thinking the same thing. By interfering with what the town considered lawful justice, He'd made himself an outlaw in their eyes. Hawkins would organize a posse, probably be at the ranch by tomorrow morning. But Jake had faced worse odds before. "I've got a defensible position and enough ammunition to make them think twice about rushing me," he said. "And maybe, if we're lucky, cooler heads will prevail." White Hawk studied him with dark eyes that seemed older than his years. "You would risk your life for someone you do not even know? Son, if you only help people you know, you don't help very many people." They reached Jake's ranch as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that reminded Jake uncomfortably of blood and bruises. The spread wasn't much a modest cabin, a barn, corrals for his horses, and cattle, but it was home, and it was defensible. The cabin sat on a small rise with good views in all directions, and Jake had positioned it well after years of thinking like a soldier. Inside, Jake cut the ropes binding White Hawk's hands and set about preparing a simple meal of beef stew and coffee. The young warrior massaged his wrists, working circulation back into his hands, and helped with quiet efficiency that spoke of a man accustomed to hard work. "Tell me about your father," Jake said as they ate. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind who believes that two different peoples can share the same land if they respect each other," White Hawk replied. "The kind who signed the treaty believing that white men's promises meant something. And now? Now he grows old watching his people suffer while he tries to hold together a peace that only one side seems interested in keeping." Jake nodded, understanding. The weight of leadership and the cost of maintaining principles in a world that often rewarded their abandonment. "What will you tell him about today?" "I will tell him that there is at least one white man who still believes in justice," White Hawk said simply. "And I will tell him that this man risked everything to save the life of someone he had never met." As they talked long into the night, sharing stories of war and loss, of family and duty, Jake began to understand that he'd saved more than just one young man's life. He'd made a choice that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the distant sound of horses moving through the darkness. Jake's instincts, honed by years of warfare, told him that trouble was approaching faster than he'd expected. What he didn't know was that the 100 Lakota warriors riding through the night toward his ranch weren't coming as enemies, but as something far more complicated and far more dangerous to everything he thought he understood about the world he lived in. Jake woke before dawn to the sound that had haunted his dreams for 11 years, the thunder of approaching cavalry. But as he rolled from his bedroll and peered through the cabin window, he realized this wasn't the U.S. Army coming to arrest him for interfering with territorial justice. This was something far more serious. 100 Lakota warriors sat their horses in the pre-dawn darkness, spread across the meadow below his cabin, like shadows come to life. They made no sound except for the occasional snort of a horse or the creak of leather, but their presence filled the valley with an electric tension that made Jake's skin crawl. War paint gleamed in the pale starlight and the points of lances, and arrows caught what little illumination filtered down from the sky. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, reaching for his rifle. Behind him, White Hawk stirred and sat up, instantly alert. "What is it?" the young warrior asked, then stopped as he heard what Jake had heard, the soft whicker of horses and the almost imperceptible sound of 100 men trying to be quiet. White Hawk moved to the window beside Jake and looked out at the assembled warriors. His intake of breath was sharp and surprised. "My father's war council," he said quietly. "All of them. The greatest warriors of 7 bands." Jake's mouth went dry. He'd faced Confederate cavalry charges, but this was different. These men were fighting for their homeland, their families, their very survival, and they were here because of him. "They come for me?" Jake asked, checking his rifle and mentally calculating how many rounds he had for a final stand. "I do not." "No," White Hawk replied honestly. "In all my years, I have never seen so many gathered in one place, except for the great hunts, or ... double." He paused, unwilling to finish the thought. "Or for war," Jake completed. "Boy, I want you to know I don't regret what I did yesterday. But I'm sorry it brought this trouble to your people." White Hawk looked at him with something that might have been respect. "You saved my life. If my father's warriors have come to kill you for it, they will have to kill me first." Before Jake could respond, a single voice cut through the morning air, deep, commanding, and speaking in English, accented with the musical quality of the Lakota language. "Jacob Mackenzie, I am Standing Bear, chief of the Oglala Lakota. I would speak with you." Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment that would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. He'd faced death before, but never with the weight of representing his entire race on his shoulders. "I'm here, Chief," Jake called back, stepping out onto his porch with his rifle held low but ready. "And I'm listening." Standing Bear urged his horse forward, separating himself from the mass of warriors behind him. He was a man in his 50s, tall and lean, with iron-gray hair braided with eagle feathers, and a face that spoke of wisdom earned through great suffering. He rode with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but there was something in his eyes that Jake couldn't quite read. "You saved the life of my son," Standing Bear said, when he was close enough for normal conversation. "White Hawk tells me you risked your own life to cut him down from the white man's rope." "I did what any decent man should do," Jake replied. "Your son was innocent of the crime they accused him of." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors at Jake's words. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "You believe this? Even though he is Lakota and you are white? Even though my people and yours have been at war?" Jake met the chief's gaze steadily. "I believe in justice, Chief Standing Bear. Your boy was trying to feed hungry children with supplies that were rightfully yours by treaty. In my book, it makes him a hero, not a criminal." Another murmur from the warriors, but this one sounded different, surprised, perhaps even approving. Standing Bear dismounted and walked closer to the porch, his movements fluid despite his age. "For 3 years, I have tried to keep peace between our peoples," the chief said. "I have watched my children grow thin while the white agent grows fat on food meant for them. I have held back my young men when they wanted to raid, when they wanted to take by force what was owed to them by law." Jake nodded, understanding where this was heading. "And now? Now my son tells me that one white man chose justice over convenience, chose courage over comfort, chose to risk everything for someone he did not know." Standing Bear stopped at the foot of porch steps, close enough that Jake could see the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes. "This changes things. How so?" Standing Bear turned and gestured to the assembled warriors. "These men rode through the night, believing we came to avenge an insult to their chief's son. They expected to find his body hanging from a tree and to water this ground with the blood of those responsible." Jake felt ice form in his stomach, and instead, they find him alive and well, saved by a white man who asked nothing in return. Standing Bear's voice carried across the meadow, ensuring that every warrior could hear his words. "They find a man who proves that not all whites have forgotten what honor means." White Hawk appeared in the cabin doorway, moving to stand beside Jake despite the potential danger. "Father, this man showed me kindness when he could have shown indifference. He showed me justice when the world showed me only prejudice." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "This is what you told the council when you rode into our camp last night. This is why I convinced them to come here not for war, but for He paused, seeming to search for the right words, for something that has never been tried before. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "What are you proposing, Chief?" Instead of answering directly, Standing Bear called out, in Lakota, to his warriors. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the effect was immediate and startling. One by one, 100 warriors dismounted and began walking toward the cabin, but not with weapons raised. Instead, they came with empty hands, their faces solemn but not hostile. "In our tradition," Standing Bear explained, "when a man saves the life of another, he becomes responsible for that life. But also, the saved man's family becomes responsible for the Savior's life. You saved my son, Jacob Mackenzie. By our law, you are now family." The warriors arranged themselves in a great semicircle around the cabin, their presence no longer threatening, but ceremonial. Jake felt overwhelmed by the gravity of what was happening, the weight of responsibility and honor being placed upon his shoulders. "Chief, I'm honored by your words," Jake said carefully, "but I'm not sure what that means in practical terms." Standing Bear smiled for the first time since his arrival, and Jake could see where White Hawk had inherited his dignity and strength. "It means that when Marshal Hawkins and his posse arrive, and they will arrive, probably within the hour, they will find that harming you means making war on the entire Oglala Nation." Jake's eyes widened as the implications hit him. "You're offering me protection?" "I am offering you family," Standing Bear corrected, "and family protects family." As if summoned by the chief's words, the distant sound of approaching horses drifted across the morning air from the direction of town. Jake counted at least 20 riders, probably Marshal Hawkins, and every man he could deputize for what they no doubt saw as a righteous mission to arrest the Indian lover, who defied territorial law. What they were about to find, instead, was a scene that would be remembered and debated for generations to come. A solitary white rancher standing alongside the most powerful Lakota chief in the territory, backed by 100 of the finest warriors the plains had ever produced. The confrontation that followed would test everything Jake Mackenzie thought he knew about courage, justice, and the true meaning of family in a land where blood and belonging weren't always determined by the color of a man's skin. Marshal Hawkins and his 20-man posse rode hard across the prairie, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground like gunshots in the crisp morning air. Hawkins had spent the night gathering every able-bodied man he could find, promising them that today they'd settle accounts with the traitor who'd sided with savages over civilized law. What they found when they crested the ridge overlooking Jake Mackenzie's ranch stopped them cold. 100 Lakota warriors sat their horses in perfect formation, their war paint and feathers gleaming in the early sunlight. At their center stood Jake Mackenzie on his cabin porch, flanked by Chief Standing Bear and White Hawk, looking for all the world like he belonged there. The sight was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what Hawkins had prepared his men for, that several of the posse members actually turned their horses around and started riding back toward town. "Hold your positions," Hawkins barked, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. He'd come expecting to arrest one stubborn rancher, not face down the largest gathering of Lakota warriors seen in the territory since Little Bighorn. Standing Bear stepped forward, his voice carrying across the distance between the two groups with commanding authority. "Marshal Hawkins, I know you by reputation. You come for this man?" Hawkins straightened in his saddle, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "That's right, Chief. Mackenzie interfered with lawful justice yesterday. He's under arrest for obstruction and aiding a criminal." "What criminal?" Standing Bear asked, his tone deceptively mild. "The Indian he helped escape, the thief." Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully, then called out in Lakota. White Hawk stepped forward, raising his voice so all could hear. "I am White Hawk, son of Standing Bear, accused of theft by the white man's. Law, I took flour and beans promised to my people by treaty food that was being sold illegally by your agent, instead of distributed as agreed. If taking what is already yours by law makes you a thief, then I am guilty. But if a man has the right to feed starving children with food that belongs to them, then I am innocent. A murmur ran through the posse. Several men looked uncomfortable, and Jake could see doubt creeping into their faces. These weren't bad men, most of them just ordinary settlers who'd been whipped up by fear and prejudice into something they wouldn't normally be. Marshall Hawkins, however, wasn't backing down. That's between you and the Indian agent, boy. Point is, you broke into Morrison's store and took goods that didn't belong to you. That's theft, plain and simple. Is it? The new voice came from behind Hawkins, and every head turned to see Agent Crawford himself riding up with a small group of men. But Crawford's arrival didn't bring the reinforcement Hawkins expected. Instead, the agent looked nervous, sweating. Despite the cool morning air, Standing Bear's eyes fixed on Crawford with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Agent Crawford, how good of you to join us. Perhaps you can explain to these men why the supplies meant for my people's children were found in Morrison's store instead of our reservation warehouse? Crawford's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about, Chief. All government. Supplies are distributed according to regulation. Are they? Jake spoke for the first time since the posse's arrival, his voice cutting through the morning air with quiet authority. Because I did some checking yesterday after I saved this boy's life. Rode over to the reservation warehouse myself. Talked to some folks. Want to know what I found? The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Crawford's horse pranced nervously, reflecting its rider's agitation. I found warehouse receipts in your own handwriting, Crawford, Jake continued, producing a bundle of papers from his jacket. Receipts showing government supplies being sold to Morrison, to the mining camps, to anyone with cash to pay. At the same time, the ledgers show those same supplies being distributed to the reservation. That's impossible, Crawford stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Standing Bear stepped closer to Crawford's horse, his presence somehow making the agent shrink in his saddle. For 2 years, my people have received half the supplies promised by treaty. For 2 years, I have wondered if your government simply did not care if our children went hungry. Now I learned that they were not forgotten, they were robbed. The weight of revelation settled over the assembled men like fog rolling in from the mountains. Jake could see understanding dawn on face after face as the implications became clear. White Hawk hadn't been stealing from Morrison. He'd been taking back what was already his people's by right. Marshall Hawkins looked between Crawford and the assembled warriors, clearly recognizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond his ability to control. Now look here, he started, but Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. Marshall Hawkins, you came here to arrest a man for saving my son from hanging. A son who was condemned for trying to feed hungry children with food that was already theirs. Do you still wish to proceed with this arrest? Hawkins looked at his posse, seeing doubt and discomfort where he'd expected righteous anger. Several men had already turned their horses toward town, unwilling to be part of what was starting to look like a grave injustice. The law is the law, Hawkins said weakly. Yes, Standing Bear agreed. It is. And the law says that stealing government property meant for Indian reservations is a federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison. His gaze fixed on Crawford with the intensity of a predator. Agent Crawford, by your own records, you have stolen thousands of dollars worth of supplies meant for my people. That makes you the criminal here, not my son. Crawford broke. It wasn't stealing, he burst out. The government doesn't send enough money to run the agency properly. I had to supplement my budget somehow. The Indians were getting most of what they needed anyway. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Even Hawkins stared at the agent in disgust, finally understanding the magnitude of what had really happened. Jake stepped down from his porch, walking slowly toward Crawford. Most of what they needed? Tell that to the mothers watching their babies cry from hunger. Tell that to the old people who didn't make it through last winter because they didn't have enough food to keep their strength up. You don't understand, Crawford pleaded. Running an agency is expensive. There are costs. There are costs to everything, Jake interrupted. But the cost of a man's integrity shouldn't be paid with children's lives. Standing Bear had heard. Enough. He turned to his warriors and spoke in Lakota, his words carrying the weight of absolute command. Immediately, 20 warriors urged their horses forward, surrounding Crawford with a wall of painted ponies and gleaming weapons. Agent Crawford, Standing Bear, said formally, "By the authority granted to me in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, I am placing you under arrest for theft of government property and violation of treaty obligations. You will be turned over to the federal marshals for prosecution under United States law." "You can't do this," Crawford protested. "You have no authority." "I have the authority granted by the same government that appointed you," Standing Bear replied calmly. "And more importantly, I have the moral authority of a leader protecting his people from thieves." Marshal Hawkins, faced with the collapse of his entire understanding of the situation, made a final attempt to salvage something from the confrontation. What about McKenzie? He still interfered with lawful arrest. Standing Bear looked at Jake with something that might have been amusement. "Marshal, yesterday this man prevented the hanging of an innocent person who was trying to recover stolen goods. In any court of law, that would be called heroism, not obstruction." Jake felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find White Hawk standing beside him. "My father speaks truth, Marshal Hawkins. Jake McKenzie did what your law should have done. He protected the innocent and stood against injustice." The sun was fully up now, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The confrontation that had begun with the promise of violence was ending with something far more powerful, the triumph of truth over prejudice, justice over convenience. One by one, the members of Hawkins' posse turned their horses toward town, unwilling to be part of arresting a man who had clearly been on the right side of a complex situation. Finally, only Hawkins himself remained, staring at Jake with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "This ain't over, McKenzie," the marshal said finally. "Yes, it is," Standing Bear replied before Jake could answer. "It is over because today two peoples chose understanding over hatred, truth over prejudice. Agent Crawford will face federal justice. My son's name is cleared. And Jacob McKenzie has proven that honor is not determined by the color of a man's skin." As the marshal rode away, trailing his defeated posse, Jake found himself standing in his front yard, surrounded by 100 Lakota warriors who no longer seemed like enemies, but like the family Standing Bear had declared them to be. "What happens now?" Jake asked. Standing Bear smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Now we eat breakfast together, and then we begin the work of building a peace that will last longer than either of us." White Hawk grinned and clapped Jake on the shoulder. "And now you learn what it truly means to be part of a Lakota family, starting with learning to cook for 100 hungry warriors." As laughter rippled through the assembled men red and white together, Jake realized that sometimes the most important battles weren't won with guns and violence, but with simple acts of courage and the willingness to see past the color of a man's skin to the content of his character. The sun climbed higher over the Montana Territory, shining down on a scene that would be remembered for generations. A solitary rancher who had chosen justice over safety, and 100 warriors who had chosen peace over vengeance, proving that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can forge the strongest bonds. And in the years that followed, When people told the story of the day Jake Mackenzie saved White Hawk from hanging, they would always end with the same words. That was the morning 100 warriors rode into his ranch and stayed for breakfast, and how the friendship between two peoples began with one man's courage to do what was right.